Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. It's another LinkedIn live stream from Veeam Software. Jason Buffington is off today, but we have a special guest, Krista Macomber from Evaluator Group. Good morning, Krista. How you doing?
Good morning, Dave. I'm wonderful. How are you doing today?
Good. The first Monday of the week is officially today, followed by only 4 more Mondays this week until the weekend again.
There you go.
So Krista is in New Hampshire right off the bat. Let's bring up our world map and encourage everyone, wherever you're at, to please, in the comments section, we do have a team monitoring the comments in the LinkedIn live chat during the live portion of our stream. Please give a shout out where you're from. If you're from a province or a state in North America, or if you're from a certain country, give us a little shout out, a little comment in there. We'll tune back into the map every now and then as we go throughout the show. But we've already got 3 countries represented, it looks like, and several states, at least 4 states in the US. So we'll come back and check that later. And of course, encourage any of your comments as we're going along and Krista and I are chatting. Please feel free to chime in on some things. I'm actually going to probably go in and post a couple comments in a little while just about some other resources that we can make you aware of that you can follow up with on some of our topics. But Krista, for anyone that may not be familiar with you or Evaluator Group, maybe just set the stage, take us through a little bit about Evaluator Group and of course about yourself, please.
Sure, absolutely. So I have the pleasure of being an analyst on the Evaluator Group team, covering both data protection and multi-cloud data management. So doing quite a bit of work with Veeam these days in that coverage area. And to your point, Dave, for those who don't know, our primary business at Evaluator Group, at least as is going to be relevant to the folks on the line today, is we actually produce research that is really designed to help IT professionals sort of navigate the buying process. So we field a lot of questions about, okay, I have this technology refresh coming up, or I'm really kind of thinking about, new technologies to cover my data protection requirements, maybe looking at new services around backup as a service, for example. What are some of the things that I should be thinking about? What are some of the kind of key products and vendors that are in this space? And really, what is going to be most applicable to me in terms of solving that problem? So really some close relationships with IT professionals from that standpoint.
That's awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. You've got a lot of really fantastic research as well as just a wealth of knowledge in general. And we were kind of joking before we went live, in this sort of pandemic time, we're all in various different offices. I got to say, your office is pretty killer, though. You can just turn around, get something out of the refrigerator. That's
It's
pretty nice.
dangerous. It's very dangerous.
You know, Evaluator Group did a specific study around pandemic and as it relates to IT and intentions. Maybe take us through a little bit of that, and I'd love to just kind of get some highlights about what you've noticed and observed. I know, you were looking at the data center specifically, and then, kind of from a financial perspective as well as overall intentions. We've got a couple slides on that. If we bring up the first one, maybe walk us through some of the IT aspects of this.
Sure, absolutely. So this is a study that we fielded in the late March, early April timeframe. And really, we wanted to sort of get an initial feel of the market in terms of the impact of COVID-19 sort of on the day-to-day life of the IT professional. Also, what are going to be some of the impacts to IT projects and priorities, as well as IT spending in general. I'll add as well that we are planning to follow up with this research this fall to sort of get, okay, now that some of the initial dust is settling, where are kind of IT professionals at? But I would say, really the takeaway from this initial research, it was really, again, when we were working through some of the early phases of the quarantines, of the work from home orders, and, we found a couple things, and really what we found is that in general, IT professionals really were in sort of what I'm kind of describing as react mode. They were trying to make sure that they could help to keep the lights on for the business. And as a result of that, they were beginning to sort of, make sure that any projects that were in flight were continuing to kind of proceed, but also beginning to kind of reevaluate what was going to be needed from an IT perspective from the mid to long term. So that's where we begin to see this chart that we have here begin to play in. And what was interesting was we found that, again, a little over 50% of the respondents we spoke to said that they are planning to continue with some of the planned capital acquisitions, so some of the planned IT infrastructure that they had already in flight. But almost 1 in 5, if you look at that next bar, indicated to us that they are beginning to plan to shift their financial resources from CapEx to more of an OpEx or a subscription-based spending. And that's really where we start to see some of these new priorities come in. For example, leveraging the cloud in particular to address some data protection requirements. This is something that came up, very frequently, and something that we see as really being directly related to that shift that we see with nearly 1 in 5, indicating that they plan to shift from CapEx to OpEx or more subscription spending.
So our thesis has been, that we're going to see more subscription activity, or that kind of roughly 1 out of 5 or 20% would pick up. At Veeam, we have something called Veeam Universal Licensing, and it's both a subscription license as well as portable, meaning you can apply it to a variety of our products, to your point, cloud or even on-prem. But I think going forward, we're kind of anticipating a bigger increase in CapEx, versus what we've known historically in the industry. If you were to hazard guess today, how do you think this might poll right now? Do you think it's changed, or do you think it's kind of staying the same?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, the mindsets are likely probably pretty steady with what we see in this chart here. So to that point, Dave, still over 50% said that they were planning to continue those CapEx. So, it's not necessarily that we were going to start seeing a landslide shift to OpEx or kind of more subscription-based spending due to the pandemic, but certainly kind of a tick in that direction. And something like the Veeam Universal License, I think anytime that things can be simplified, anytime that customers can, maybe save a little bit through bundling some various different software subscriptions together, we're certainly seeing an appetite for that in the market. Especially with the state of the global economy, especially coming out of or as we're working through, I should say, the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, budgets are in many cases even tighter than they were before. They're really being evaluated with a lot of scrutiny for what is really strategic. What are some areas that we can save some money and maybe make a little bit more room in the budget to spend a little bit more against some of these more strategic areas?
Yeah, good point. And while we're bringing up the next slide, which talks about technology, maybe a quick question about who got surveyed for this COVID-19 study?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, from a survey standpoint, it was kind of an online survey that approximately 300 individuals took. These were IT professionals, so a lot of the times IT directors and things like that, really people that are kind of, feet on the street, really dealing with these issues every day. As a firm at Evaluator Group, we do primarily work with larger enterprises, roughly 1,000 or more employees. So, the majority of the respondents did come from that, kind of organization size, and really from across a range of industries as well. And I would like to add as well that we sort of complemented that with a number of in-depth interviews, because we did want to get just really more color, especially with this kind of unprecedented situation that we all find ourselves in. We wanted to get more color around, okay, what really are you facing every day? What are you really thinking over the next few months? And really some topics like that.
Awesome. I'm being told we've got some activity on the map. Let's do a quick map check if we could. We've got, hey, wow. So, it's amazing, Krista. South America, just in the Middle East, India. I mean, it's amazing week in, week out. They really tune in. So we've got Italy, Algeria, Turkey, France, India, Romania, Peru, Norway, and that might be a first for us. Brazil, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Colombia, Switzerland, Indonesia. And then looking at the US side of things, we've got Michigan, looks like New York. Outstanding. Thanks. And please keep it coming, either comments or just a shout out where you're from, but great representation globally. Thank you so much for tuning in. Krista, let's close off on this topic and look at the second slide on your COVID-19 study. Take us through some of the technology areas. I mean, kind of no surprise, cyber pops right up to the top.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And I know that a little bit later in the conversation, we're going to be talking in more detail about ransomware and about cyber threats. But, really what we were hearing consistently, especially in these interviews that I referenced, was there certainly was, in some cases, a very significant uptick in ransomware attacks, in really just kind of cyber criminal activity with these bad actors, if you will, trying to take advantage of the pandemic, individuals working remotely, people just looking for different sources of information as to launch some of these attacks. So certainly we saw that being really a number one priority. And then number two, very closely related, upgrades to data protection and disaster recovery. This is where we found a lot of IT professionals sort of indicated they were caught a little bit flat-footed. They thought that they were better prepared to be able to facilitate this remote environment because some individuals said, yes, really this is a DR scenario for us because we're having to activate some of this infrastructure to make sure that we have, the accessibility, the connectivity that our business users need. And, we found that we just weren't prepared for it. So we heard a lot about things like we're going to have to increase the number of backups that we do every day. We're larger scale and test more consistently. And really, really this sort of coming to the forefront as an important priority during the pandemic, certainly.
Awesome. See, we got a question coming in from, I believe, Rahul asks about AIX. And Jason Buffington, actually, although out today, is going to chat and get back to you on AIX. I'll give a quick shout out, though. We're just released the new update on our AIX solution, or right on the process of releasing that update. So thanks for the question there. If I switch back, Krista, you've recently completed some research around backup as a service. And I thought it was pretty neat. You have your own acronym, I believe, BU capitals, and then AAS, capital S at the end there, of course. So maybe a little bit of color around that. Veeam was very happy to participate in that with you, and you took a couple different views of how you look at different workloads.
Yep, certainly. And we were very happy for Veeam to participate in this research. So really, you mentioned acronyms, Dave, and what we find is that there's a lot of terminology just when we think about leveraging the cloud for data protection in general, a lot of different terminologies and acronyms being used in the industry today. And we tried to really simplify it to really look at essentially backup software that is being hosted by a third-party service provider. Of course, today, typically this being hosted in the cloud and really being delivered through a SaaS model. And really, so this graphic here, that backup software handling the capabilities that you see in these darker blue boxes. So handling the backup jobs themselves, obviously typically handling the recovery as well. And then many solutions today also handling tiering of data to a folder sort of archive or long-term retention storage repository. A couple other just quick comments I'll make here. This particular graphic is really intended to reflect leveraging a backup as a service solution to protect on-prem data sources. We see a range of application systems, things like that. And typically these can be backed up as reflected here to the public cloud, kind of a storage repository for backup. Oftentimes they can be backed up to sort of an on-prem object store. And then typically we're going to be leveraging the cloud for long-term for long-term retention. And typically you're going to be looking for some flexibility in terms of where can you recover to. Can you recover to the cloud? Sometimes that is going to make sense. But then sometimes you do need to be able to recover to an on-premises offering, oftentimes for things like security and compliance and things like that. That's really what we're reflecting here. Yep.
You mentioned object storage, and we've seen a rise in, well, just a number of really credible, capable on-prem object storage solutions. A lot of times you think object storage, you think of S3 and Amazon itself, but there's, with the immutability capability or S3 object lock and some of the really compelling financially and ease of use wise object storage solutions on the market today, definitely worth taking a look at that. Now, you also looked at cloud-based workloads or cloud-native workloads as well, which didn't look like a radically dissimilar picture, but a little bit different nonetheless.
Yep, yeah. Really, those core capabilities in this instance still being handled by that backup software. So there's backup jobs, the recovery, the data tiering. One thing that I will add is both for the on-prem and the cloud data sources, a lot of the times we're seeing that these backup jobs are sort of what we call really SLA, service level kind of driven. So there's policies being set in place to sort of determine when the data is going to be backed up. Oftentimes these recoveries can be sort of self-service just to kind of speed up that process, really make it a little bit easier for your application owner, your database admin, for example, to be able to handle those. The big difference here is that typically you're not going to be backing up your cloud data source typically to on-prem. Typically, you're just going to be doing sort of a cloud-to-cloud backup. Most of the time, that's going to be what makes sense. And then I will add too, oftentimes these recoveries are going to be in the cloud, but we do get questions from customers about, can I recover my cloud data source to on-prem? And yes, some of these solutions do allow that, again, depending on what your requirements are. But to your point, Dave, a lot of consistency here between the capabilities offered both for on-prem and for those some sort of cloud native sources.
Yeah. Best practices remain best practices no matter the workload or the deployment style.
Yeah, yes, that they do. And in fact, sometimes that can be the value for some of these backup as a service solutions if they can protect both kind of cloud and on-prem, or if they can protect a few different cloud native sources. It can introduce some consistency in terms of how that data is treated both during the backup and during the recovery processes, because obviously you're going to need that, especially for things like security and compliance and things of that nature.
Nice. Well, I spent almost the entire weekend cleaning the house, and I came up with this, one of the original backup as a service plans that Weston was nice enough to donate to me. But this was good. I should have found this in the pandemic because it's a roll of toilet paper inside of there. And, it's good to have a backup plan. It would have been really handy in 2020 had I come across that a little bit earlier. But awesome research on backup as a service and a way to kind of put from a, what must be considered rather in a framework around how to approach the different workloads. And I want to kind of switch gears a little bit, kind of a call back really to your IT intentions in terms of security being so high. And it's almost remiss in this day and age not to mention cyber or ransomware. And I just would love to get a little perspective on what you're seeing out there in the field.
Yeah. So, I think ransomware, especially over the last, kind of 18, 24 months, ransomware already was an important topic. And I think during the pandemic just has become a more important topic, especially as we're thinking about kind of protection. One of the big changes that we've seen really over the past, call it 12 to 18 months or so, is that the backup data itself is starting to be targeted by these attackers. And in fact, these attackers are actually, you've seen instances where they're actually releasing customer data as well. So this is part of why this is both becoming more important, but also why it's becoming a little bit more difficult for IT to be able to sort of identify when a ransomware attack is occurring and also how to recover from it as well.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I mean, it's gotten nastier, if that's even possible. It's not slowing down in terms of the threat potential, but also the type of activity and just how targeted and kind of malicious it can be, meaning a lot of healthcare organizations are getting targeted.
It is. Yeah. And it's definitely, I think, very challenging. And these attackers are seeing the opportunity and they're not saying, okay, it's a pandemic, we're going to kind of take a break here. No, it's okay. This is a great opportunity, like you mentioned, Dave, to target some of these organizations, like healthcare organizations, but also to understand, okay, more individuals are working remotely. They're going to be a little bit more distracted. They're going to be looking for information about their health, about what's going on in the world with the pandemic. So these are a number of ins that we see them trying to leverage.
Yep. And I would be remiss if I didn't do a call back. Usually I'm kind of pointing ahead, but I want to do a call back to last Friday's live stream. Our Rick Vanover and Melissa Palmer did a fantastic live stream on ransomware. So that was actually just this past Friday, and it's on our LinkedIn page under the Veeam site. And then 4 months ago, which it's hard to imagine this was that long ago, but 4 months ago, Rick did an initial ransomware discussion solo by himself that was outstanding. We're at almost 6,000 views on Rick's ransomware from 4 months ago now. But I definitely would encourage you, and it doesn't matter if you really do anything with Veeam at all, just some best practices and tips between the two videos. It's not even an hour's worth of your time and literally could save you from many, many days or even longer of trying to put back together your data center. But two great streams right there with some great resources. Rick is always fantastic. And definitely, Krista, we usually get 2,000 to 2,500 views per stream. Rick is kind of king of the hill at about 6,000. So it's really been a well watched stream, as well as great information to protect yourself. And it's not always even about product. I will mention some product things, but a lot of what Rick goes through is just delineation of responsibilities, hardening passwords, having different passwords for the different components, just making it more and more challenging for the bad actors.
Yes, and this is some of these things you mentioned, Dave, are very important. So during the COVID research that I mentioned, we did ask the IT professionals we spoke with. We did ask them about, okay, what are some of the actions that your organization is taking, to try to be better prepared? And certainly, I mentioned earlier in the conversation things like taking backups more regularly, testing your recovery strategy at scale. But there was a lot of discussion as well about just sort of training and building awareness and making sure that as individuals are working remotely, they are aware of what these best practices are in terms of how to access information, in terms of, where they're storing their information and things like that. So, I certainly think these topics are timely because that's really, a lot of the times that's the front lines is the end user in terms of opening up some of these holes for a ransomware attack to be able to occur.
Yep. A little bit of a Veeam plug, Krista, I'll take you through this. You probably have heard of 3-2-1 rule, meaning 3 copies of data, 2 different kinds of media, one of which is offline. We've actually at Veeam now taken that a step further, and we've added on some digits. In the US, we have 5 digits for a zip code, but we sometimes think about this in terms of what you can do to most protect yourself. In addition to a lot of the great tips that Rick and Melissa mentioned in their live streams, but this starts off the same. 3 different copies of data. In the era of people rushing to deduplicate data, it was almost important to remind folks about 10, 15 years ago, hey, don't have too few copies. You do want to make sure you've got a reasonable number of copies of data. You do want to have different pieces of media so that they can be read by different kinds of devices. You do want one that's geographically dispersed or off-site. But there's some Veeam unique capabilities here. So this is a little bit of a Veeam commercial, but it's one that really can prevent a bad day or very many bad weeks in a row. And that is, the first one is having an offline or air-gapped immutable copy of that data. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. Certainly tape is still valid. You can look at some of the object storage solutions that support S3 object lock. There's some things you can do with policies and procedures and snapshot to achieve that. But we recommend that you've got something that's hardened. And so that we add that one in there. The last thing that we add, that 0, is Veeam has a capability called data labs. We actually pioneered this a decade ago, the notion to be able to instantly mount data instead of having to stream or restore it fully. When we do a data lab activity or mount that data, then we can do a number of interesting things. One of which is perform what we call a sure backup or do some integrity checking. And it's much more sophisticated than just can I mount or ping a machine. It's if it's going to be, say, a SQL server, we can start issuing SQL queries automatically as part of the backup process. Because there's a bad joke, Krista, you can't restore data you haven't backed up. And another variation on that is you can't restore it if it wasn't backed up properly. So, what better time than at the point you take a backup to ensure the integrity of that backup and then to protect it in all of the preceding ways with either different kinds of copies or media or offsite and immutability.
Certainly, we do look at integrity checks as kind of an important capability, kind of within data protection. Certainly, it's part of our data protection software research that we do. And I will say, you bring up some great points around. It's even more important today than it ever has been to be able to understand what is my last good backup and really know that that is your last good backup. Especially as I mentioned, these ransomware variants are certainly infiltrating that backup data. So it's not as simple as just, okay, I'm going to restore from my latest backup. Certainly, it's more sophisticated than that. And I'd add just another comment regarding sort of air gapping, immutability. As we built out this backup as a service research we were speaking about a few minutes ago, we had a number of interesting conversations with vendors and with customers as well regarding air gapping, because a lot of the times you do think about, that tape solution that's offsite, and certainly that remains a viable approach. There's also a number of new interesting ways you can do things like leverage the cloud just to be able to get some of that isolation that an air gap kind of tape-based strategy that we're all kind of most familiar with. So it's we see a lot of vendors getting very creative with how to do this, and I think from a customer standpoint, it's important to be able to really understand, okay, how am I going to be able to get that isolation if I'm going to be looking to leverage something other than kind of an offsite tape copy for my air gap.
Yeah, great point. Well, as we begin to wind up, let's take one last look at the map. I'm told we've got a couple questions coming, or a couple questions, but a couple new countries. It looks like, wow, Guatemala, which might be a first for us. Thank you for tuning in. Vietnam also. We've got a fair amount of APJ, Asia Pacific Japan, going on as well. So nice representation. We've checked off just about every time zone, I think. And we also have a question: what kind of backup services are trending now, cloud or own storage? I'll answer really quickly, Rohit. Honestly, we see both. That's kind of a cop-out answer, but cloud very, very much on the rise, but it's not to say that people are decommissioning their data centers. So it's really, I see it dependent on the workload and then dependent upon where you're at in your asset management strategy. But Krista, let me give you last word on that.
I would completely agree, Dave. Especially, so I mentioned that we work primarily with larger enterprises, and we don't see that customers are really looking to rip and replace all of their kind of existing data protection solutions. A lot of the times, the way backup as a service is being introduced is to be able to protect, for example, a specific application like Microsoft 365. So it's sort of, I think really the question that you need to start with is, what objectives am I trying to meet? And is a backup as a service solution going to be able to address those? That's really where we advise that customers start with. And that's really going to help to direct, okay, do you go to kind of a hosted model, or do you kind of look to expand your existing on-prem solution? But a lot of the times these backup as a service offerings are making sense to be able to kind of control that on-premise footprint and really be able to more simply and quickly provide some protection for some of these new and critical assets that are entering the enterprise.
Great, great. Well, as we wind down, I want to point to a couple upcoming items. We've got, in addition, some live streams that we past referenced. We've got this Friday, we're going to be having, it looks like Usman Asif will be going through a multi-part series beginning this Friday around Veeam and AWS. So check out Usman on that on Friday. But Krista, take us through really quickly a little bit of a new evaluator research as well.
Yes. Yep. So we did, just a couple of weeks ago, we did, this is new research regarding backup as a service. So we do have what we call a vendor comparison matrix. This goes through some of the key kind of features and capabilities that we hear from customers are important. And it goes across a whole number, I believe more than 15 products and vendors, and sort of talks about how each product or vendor either does or does not address these capabilities. And then we have a series of 4 papers that are really designed to help customers to sort of get their footing and what is backup as a service, what are some of the questions that I should be thinking about as I'm evaluating some of these solutions, and also sort of to provide more context into what these different vendors can provide and what really these different products can do. So those are all available on our website.
Outstanding. I'll give one shameless plug myself, a call back. I was last week, was on a pod, Data Protection Gumbo, fantastic podcast. If you're watching this stream, I encourage you to check out this podcast, not just this episode, but subscribe to that pod in general. Demetrius Marlborough does a really good job on there. We did have a question come in. It looks like Jason's answered that. So with that, I think it's time to wrap up. And Krista, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to visit with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, and appreciate everybody that joined today.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you all. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream. Bye now.
Take care.